Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Uh, Today I'm super excited to have with me Grace. Grace, thanks for coming on.
I'm super excited to be here too.
Yeah, so I reached out to Grace. We were on a radical exchange community call, and she was rambling about, or not rambling, but discussing. Um, we were talking about AI and data marketplaces, and you were actually talking about how maybe we don't want to set up a market for certain things. Um, and it sort of led me to look more into you, and I realized that you actually have a lot of writings on the space, which was super good. So before we kind of dive into like the current topics, I wanted to like actually set up like what kind of your background and some things. And I've read maybe like we can start off. I'll read like an interesting quote I read from you, and then maybe
Cool.
we can see if you still agree with it, or from there. But I think it would be a good place to start. I was reading you run a project called Voices of Humanity, and in the white paper you had actually said, I quote, thousands, hundreds, or even tens of years ago, the free rider problem was a reality. If you lived in a hunting or agricultural village, everyone needed to do their part for survival. Humans developed competitive societies and economies founded on the need for everyone to work. We created societies where people needed to work for wages to pay for food and shelter. We no longer live in a world of scarcity. There's enough food, shelter, clothing, and education and healthcare for everyone. Times have changed, yet our monetary system, societies, cultures are founded on the idea that you must work to survive. Why? If robots and AI are producing most of what we need, why would we insist that people choose death or poverty when they can't work? Why is anyone struggling at all when there's enough of everything for everyone? So it kind of goes into this abundance mindset. This was written. I think you wrote this like 6 years ago. Was
Yeah.
wondering kind of if this is still what you see as kind of a crux of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, look, if there's enough food for everybody, why would anyone starve to death? Like, do we feel okay about that as humans? Because it's inhumane, right? If there's actually enough food for everyone to eat, then everyone should eat. And this idea, and it's not only the idea that you have to work, it's that certain things get paid and certain things don't get paid. And so if you go to a yoga class, the yoga teacher gets paid, but the yoga students pay. And if you really look at your life, you'll find out that the things you pay for and the things that have value and the things that you get paid to do versus the things you do for fun or volunteer, there's no real correlation if you think about the real value of them. And if you look at this idea even of free markets, then you wonder why the toilet cleaners don't get paid more than the lawyers. Because who would want to be a toilet cleaner? And so you realize the whole illusion that we've been sold about this, everything they've told us about this particular market system that we're in, almost all of it is untrue.
So I mean, like, why? I guess like you in some of your writings you talk about it's time for sort of a new setup for it, right? And this
Yeah.
is like why did it get set up like this? Like the initial, like the Adam Smith, like this was sort of a way to distribute goods, right? Markets are a way to figure out how to distribute things.
Well, I wasn't there at the time, but I do know that at the time there were some economic theorists that said the truth about where stuff comes from, and stuff comes from nature. The air we breathe, the water we breathe, the apple we eat, the oil we get out of the ground, everything has its basis in nature. And I can't remember the name of this economist. It was a French economist, but he had economic models that came out of saying, well, actually, the fundamental thing is the farmers and the earth and maintaining the earth. Now, this is clearly true. Um, it's true. Like none of the things that we've got here are just like appearing there
Right.
from the earth. And so that economic model was more based in reality. But the main thing to really recognize about economic models is that they didn't come out of mathematics, they came out of philosophy.
Right.
And so these are a bunch of philosophers making up ideas, and some of them got adopted for whatever political reasons, whatever. Maybe they knew the people in power, or it was their brother, or I don't know. Why did those ones get adopted? And then if you learn macroeconomics, I learned mathematics in my undergraduate, and I ended up in tech. That's why you're talking to me, because
Yeah.
we're in tech. But I remember learning in my MBA about macroeconomics and thinking, this isn't math. Like none of this actually pans out. And for example, we all know this today. We all feel it in our pockets that when you look at, they have this in macroeconomics, like when inflation goes up, your salaries go up with them. And that's never been true in my lifetime, right? Like there's always a gap and they still teach this. If you go to a macroeconomics teacher, they'll show you these graphs, they'll show you these supply and demand graphs and whatever. And if you look at the reality is that that's not true. And still, you're allowed to philosophize and teach macroeconomic numbers and graphs that are empirically wrong. That's a very bizarre type of discipline. So, and the reason I got into this, just to give a little more context, Voice of Humanity and everything I do is about new forms of democracy. Because guess what? We've all noticed our current form of democracy is in trouble. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, autocracy coming soon to a country near you. So I knew this already 15, 20 years ago. Right? Democracy is in decline and we need to invent something new. Why not invent something new? I'm a tech bro. I'm like, hey, if something's not working, you invent something new. This whole thing about, Winston Churchill and democracy is the worst, except all the other ones. I'm like, so what? We're humans. We invent things.
Right.
Let's invent a thing. And what's really shifted in over this time since I wrote that white paper, and now I have a book called So You've Got a DAO. And I'm going to be writing another book, which is going to talk about some of the things we can implement now. Since then, I've realized that democracy, it's not so much about decision making, because the way we make decisions, like if you think about what you're going to eat for lunch today, you think you're deciding it, but actually there's a whole supply chain behind it, and like how much time you have for lunch and how long your lunch break is and what's in the refrigerator right now. And like all these things. And you're like, and then I'm going to decide. So the way that I'm looking at things is that there's actually three parts of governance. One is the circulatory system, which is how we get goods from one place to another, which is what we were just talking about. Economics and monetary systems are the way that we move resources from one place to another. And so circulatory system. So if you pass an anti-money laundering law, it'll never work because it's like shutting down your circulatory system in one place, because that's our circulatory system. Money always moves. And then the second one is our regulatory system. So my body never goes over a certain temperature. That's regulatory, by the way. We used to have systems in which the doors didn't fall off airplanes. But now we have systems in which you fine people after the door falls off the airplane. That's the difference between regulatory and legislative. And we're confused about that right now. So I want to be really clear. Regulation means the door doesn't fall off and the airplane doesn't crash, not that somebody gets in trouble later. We want regulation. Legislation, okay, I don't care, right? And then the final one
We're
is
in crypto here. This is, we know all about it.
Yeah. Like we don't want the rug pulls and we don't want the punishment. We want some actual like something that makes sure the system stays within certain bounds. And then the final one is the media, is the information system. So I need to know that, this food is edible and smell it and whatever and taste it. Otherwise I might drink poison. So that's sensory. And as you know, our sensory system, the media, is not a good source of information. And so I've moved away from decision-making systems in my thinking to those three systems. And that's why monetary circulation and this idea that people should eat is a really important part of what I consider part of governance.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of the issue, I think, a lot of times when you look at some of these governance systems, especially in crypto, like we have this idea that we just want to go create our own, right? Like it's the network state ideal.
Yeah.
Like we're just going to exit the current US system, leave all these people over here, and we're going to go to Gulch or wherever that values my my hard work, and we can distribute it properly. Like, how do you think about that balance between building these new systems and then working within the reality of the physical world which we live
Yeah.
and take place?
So it's interesting. There will be a new system. The current one is crumbling. This is the case. It's going to be whatever between 10 and 200 years to make that transition, something like that. So we might not see it, but certainly that's happening. The network state people tend to be techno utopians. And also what you said, like that our work, we should get paid for our work. These tend to be very privileged people who have won in the current system. They're the winners of the current system, saying how the current system is bad. It's like, wow, Elon Musk wants to live on Mars. I'm like, if the system's not working for you, my friend, Mr. Musk, who is it working for? Like, this is crazy, right? So the people who've actually been the winners in the current system are trying to build a better system. How's that going to look, right? It's not going to help the losers in the current system.
Right.
So these are good conceptual ideas in some ways, and in other ways, they have huge flaws. And they don't basically say everybody should eat, which people are like, oh, communism, but it's basic, right? If you see a hungry dog on the street, you would feed it. But we don't do that for other human beings. And so these are fundamentally interesting ideas, like exit the current society. And you've seen that in the hippie movements and ecology movements and all over the world, and anarchist movements. And it will happen. It's just going to not necessarily happen at the speed that we want. And it's not clear which of these systems will work. And the idea that you should be able to choose your own governance system, well, that makes sense, right? That's the fundamental. And where there's a geographic reality that we have to deal with. You see something like Prospera or some of these other fairly successful experiments, but they're based on like somebody built those roads and the airport and the electrical grid, and you're like, oh, I'm going to piggyback off of that. So it's kind of a blindness to all of the physical infrastructure that somebody else has built for you. And now you're like, we're a free state. It's like, well, how did you get that telephone line and cell phone tower?
Right. Yeah. It is because I think like a lot of times like you have people with a lot of value here and they want to see if they can take it. But it's almost like, well, what is that value? Like it comes back to like the fundamental question, like, can you actually move value across borders, or is value tied in to some of the people and some of the actual infrastructure of the town? Um,
And also, what this idea that money is value isn't, it's like money is a circulatory system, it's a resource distribution system, and it can be distributed anywhere in the world, which is why we love crypto, right?
sure.
We can move our resources where we want, but there are consequences in terms of value when you move things. So if you move rare earth metals out of the ground, you've harmed some human beings, you've polluted the environment. So you've harmed value somewhere else. And all of us value clean water and clean air. And money doesn't do that. And you can change the quality of your air and your water on Earth. And we certainly have, but not for the better. And you can use money to move resources in order to encourage these other values. But it's mostly we're blind to it. And money blinds us to it very intentionally.
Yeah, I mean the one quote I always think about is like, markets give people with capital what they think they want. So markets will move in that direction generally. So it doesn't necessarily, kind of like you were talking about, like markets are one way of distribution. Democracy is one, and there's a whole plethora of other ones that people are kind of experimenting with now.
But this thing about markets giving people what they think they want is an incredibly superficial way of thinking about it. Because what's happened along the way between you and the thing is a lot of misinformation about the thing that you're getting and about your value as a human being. Like, if you don't wear this thing or whatever, have this thing, you're not going to be cool and people won't like you. And like, that's really big disinformation that tells you a lot of stuff. And, you'll be more virile if you have this particular type of car. That's not really true. We all know it. So it's a lot of misinformation. And then there's a lack of information about how that thing got to you. If you had to watch a movie about every piece of labor that went into your cell phone, you wouldn't want it. So there's a lot of false information or lack of information being sent to you through this whole market, and fake desire being generated.
Well, you almost like it's almost the necessity of regulatory action, right? Like it's, like I think that's maybe one of the mistakes people with crypto make is as you're trying to make these, you assume that just free markets will push it. Like that's kind of like on your information about the wages. Like
Mhm.
people would say like, well, if you don't like the wages that are being put in, you would just move to a more free wage cell phone, right? Or like a better wage producer cell phone if that actually meant anything to you. And that their argument would be that this is more of a revealed preference that you actually don't care. Um, and I don't know, maybe, but it's also a
I
lack of
don't know.
options, right?
Right. And it's also systemic, right? It's one of the things about crypto and why I'm here is we could create other systems. The idea that you have to use money in order to move resources around isn't true anymore. So, for example, even if you think about the classic, even if you believe this evolution of money story that they tell you is that, oh, it was hard for people to barter because if you had cows and I had arrows, maybe you don't need arrows because you're not a hunter, you've got cows, and now I can never get beef, right? Because you never
Sure.
need arrows. Um, Even if that were true, which it's not clear that it was true, right now we have databases. So we don't even need money to make sure that there's reasonable distribution, right? In the plurality book, Audrey Tang's plurality book, they mention it. It's like we could move beyond money. Everything is inventoried in big databases. We could just make sure nobody goes hungry. And if you think about something like digital identity, so in India, every single person has a digital identity with the Aadhaar system, and they use their iris scan or retina scan for all of their services. If you go to the healthcare or the supermarket or whatever,
So what
you don't have
country
to
is
use.
this?
This is India. AADHAR is Aadhaar system. They've had this for years, almost a decade. So everybody, there's like 1.5 billion people, has a digital identity that is known by their government with biometrics. And if you think about that from a database perspective, actually, if anybody starved in the country, it would be the government's fault because you know that this family didn't go to their normal shopping
Right.
because you have that all now in a database. And so as soon as you start to have these digital identities, which everybody's talking about, I'm flying and you've got to have a real ID, like as soon as your government knows who everybody is and how much they spent on groceries last week and whether it was the same as 3 weeks ago, now who's responsible if somebody's going hungry? And does your government really want to take that responsibility? Let me tell you, they don't. But now you're really in an ethical situation where you've almost declared as a government, we're willing to track everything people do. And if they're suffering, we're willing to just pretend it's not happening.
Right.
That doesn't seem okay to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is like the classic. It's almost like, well, they use it to sell the systems to, in like, if you have a perfect surveillance systems, then theoretically there should be no kidnapped children, right?
Right?
But like
Yeah.
at the same time, like there are trafficked children, but then we can perfectly find, someone who they actually want to find.
Yeah. Isn't that
So,
bizarre?
yeah,
And so all of these things are, yeah, if you have perfect information, you should make perfect decisions, shouldn't you?
yeah.
If there were such a thing. Yeah.
Well, kind of like on democracy, like people, you would say though that there's as you get the full tech surveillance and authoritarian control or not even authoritarian control but authoritarian ability, then the risk there is that they can make big mistakes, right? That like one,
Well, yeah. Well, like, for example, what if, I mean, it's really hard to imagine, but what if your government decided that you weren't allowed to leave your home because you might be infectious, or that you couldn't eat in a restaurant unless you took a medical procedure?
right,
That could happen if you had a surveillance state, and people are like, whoa, what? But that happened.
right.
And that happened in a place where there was only surveillance. Central bank digital currencies and programmable money means something else. Programmable money means you pull into the gas station, it's like, oh, you're over your carbon limit right now, and you don't get any gas. That's programmable money, not surveillance. So that is regulation. And it's not the regulation we want. And it's quite easy to imagine at this point something like a universal basic income, but it dictates that you need to buy your food according to what we think is food. And that's very easy to imagine because in this country, you're not allowed to have raw milk, right? Unpasteurized raw, like really hard contraband. There's certain types of vegetables you're not allowed to eat. And if you just grew this in your backyard and slaughtered it in your backyard, well, that's not allowed. So it's very easy to imagine what types of regulations might come in if you could control what people bought at the point of purchase.
Right. So
this type of education might not be education you're allowed to have. Ooh. Mm.
All right. We're just we just hit every hippie topic.
But again, this is programmable money. We're in the crypto, right? We're in the programmable money industry, and we're trying to explain the difference between what we have, which is decentralized, anonymized money, and what the government might issue you as digital money. And it's a big difference.
Well, I mean, so what, I guess we can just ask the question, what should we be building more of? Obviously, like we had this vision back in, in 2009 when Bitcoin was launched, like it was supposed to be a permissionless money, and that hasn't worked out. We're probably farther away than we were in 2009. So what are we doing wrong? How can we build some systems?
I think it's the disembodiment. At the very least, I've been saying this for 5 years. I said this at it was like the Web3 summit before the lockdowns. I said, look, if we were smart as the Ethereum community, because the government doesn't want people to be independent and have their network state and do their own thing. I mean, if you can control people, why wouldn't you? But, like it's just normal to want that. I'm not even saying it certainly is a little bit evil, but it's a normal human thing. We should be thinking as the crypto community, where is our communication network coming from? Where is our server? And where is our electricity coming from? And we have very conveniently ignored all of that. If I were the Ethereum Foundation back in the day, I would have said, okay, let's build some little farms, server farms with people farms. And let's tell people they can work there and develop all this code and develop what they want, but we're going to generate our own electricity at the very least, so we don't support any of the physical networks that we're dependent on. And we just had that power outage in Spain as like, oh, whoops. I mean, all of our entire industry could disappear. Most of our hosting is probably on AWS. Like, this is not a good scene for us as an industry.
Well, I feel like this kind of goes back to the market decisions, right? Like we just said, okay, well, how are we going to distribute who runs a node or who runs a validator? And we said, whoever provides the most capital gets to do it. And that was sort of a method of distribution. As you can guess, like since we didn't have I don't know if we have a way to say that you have to run, a home server, like we can't do that. We don't technologically know how. So it naturally went towards the cheapest cost option, which was AWS.
I get a VPS, and who knows where my actual server is and under what jurisdiction it is. And it's big trouble for us, ultimately. And Cardano, I think, is reasonably distributed. But and who uses Cardano?
Right. It's okay. This podcast doesn't like Cardano.
I don't dislike Cardano. They're actually a little bit more buttoned up than everybody else. It's really interesting. The ethos. I'm chain agnostic.
Okay.
I'm chain agnostic, but they're a little bit more of a buttoned up community. But they're the lowest. They're actually the lowest footprint and one of the most highly distributed blockchains that we have.
But do you think it should go more? Like, do you think we should care more about that? Like, because the problem is like, how do you care about who runs a node and not have it be, it's the classic governance problem.
It's a very good problem.
Because like if you want to distribute it equitably, then you have to have governance. You can't leave it up to the market, or else it just clearly doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult to do when you're talking about money, which is why I think we're going to evolve into more resource-based economies. Because when you have money, it's very easy to accumulate and hoard. But let's say you've got, I mean, even housing, right? How big do you want your house? You've got to clean it, right? And you've got to take care of it, and you've got to maintain your backyard and all those things. So, and food certainly goes bad. So how much food can you have? And so I think that resource-based economies will be part of what humanity goes back to, and commons. We've forgotten that most of the things that we really need, like air and water, are commons. And those are not governed as commons anymore. They're governed as private things. And then you get what's called the tragedy of commons, but it's actually the tragedy of private ownership. It's the tragedy of enclosure. And so I think that one of the things people need to go back to is community owned resources and shared resources. We could have a lot more resources for ourselves if we would share some of these things in ways that we're self governed by the people who are using them.
Right. Well, I mean, this is like, this has always been one of the dreams of crypto, like especially DAOs. Like you would have a distributed ownership of something, right? Like, and this is a lot of people are talking about like with AI. So like, okay, so AI is going to do all of this work and it's going to basically be omnipotent and able to create a bunch of things. As long as we have distributed ownership of it, this will be great. The big problem is like every other example in history of like, okay, we have automation of factories that get rid of workers. Now we all don't have to work. It's like, no, they just fire the workers and keep the profits for themselves and inequality goes up, So like you would expect the same thing to happen here. Like as workers get displaced by AI, that it would just increase profits for the wealthy. Like how do you force, kind of like back to the Ethereum question, how do you force a distribution? Or does it have to be more social in some aspect?
Yeah. So I have a little bit of coffee making in the background here, which is
I
fine.
can't hear it at all. Zoom does a great job.
Okay, good. Great job. So yeah, like I think my headphones have kind of blocked that out. So good. Um, so it doesn't happen overnight in the kind of timeframes that we're talking about. So that's the first thing to say. It will be forced. The system is under collapse. In every empire, what happens is the inequality rises to a point where people won't take it anymore. And, people have to produce food on the ground. There isn't another way to produce food, like whatever it is. Like we have all this factory produced food, but it's making us really quite sick indeed. And it's making our soil sick, and soil is becoming less and less productive everywhere that we've been trying to produce more food than the actual microbes in the soil can produce. So we're going to be faced with it in different ways, in different places, and at different times, and in different cultures. So it's not going to happen one way. I could imagine something like, so the biggest landowner in the United States, or the biggest agricultural landowner in the United States, is Bill Gates. Like that's just the case right now.
Yep.
So how can you actually control that? Some places it may be very controlled with the military, but you could imagine a bunch of different things. You could imagine secession of certain states. You could imagine farm workers just being like, we won't work on those things. We're only gonna, whatever, we're gonna take over the farm by violence in this particular area. You could imagine some local people saying, listen, it's a really nice farm you have over there. We wouldn't want anything to happen to it. So we're going to protect this one corner of it for you, Mr. Gates. And Mr. Gates would never know, because the number of nodes between Mr. Gates and the actual, so you can imagine a bunch of like little revolutionary models happening on the ground where people are like, we're going to grow our own food in this corner, and then nothing will happen. Like a fire would not happen to you because we're going to protect you, right? So you can imagine all kinds of different things. And you can also imagine these network states. Some of them are going to be techno-utopian, but some of them are going to be hippies or eco-villages. And we're seeing people going back to, more types of homesteading and things like that. The most important thing is going to be to build relationships. But also, I've heard on some podcasts I've been hearing little whispers of even the big food companies know that this way of agriculture can't keep working. And people know that they need air. And so there's going to be a shift even within corporate, I think, to look at how do we keep producing food, because our soils are coming apart. And some of this more organic agriculture is happening, and that has to happen with more and more workers. AI isn't going to do it. I think that we're going to see the breakdown of the current experiment, which is a weird experiment. And for most of human history, in most places, 80 to 90% of the people were working on the land. And we've flipped it. Now 80% of us work on these computers. And I think we're going to slowly see a migration off of that because somebody's got to build these things on the ground. And
Well, I think like we all want to. Like I think this is the funny part. Like you talk to every tech bro and they're like, man, I hope I make enough money that I can turn off my computer and go work on the farm. And like everybody like sort of wants to, but then at the same time they're like, but I can't support a family doing that. So like, it kind of comes back to that distribution issue. Like, we want certain qualities of life, but they're hard.
That's why I say it's a 50-year project, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm really glad to hear that, actually. I'm really glad to hear. I mean, my son is like, I don't want to live in the city anymore, but my daughter's like, she loves living in the city. So I'm glad to hear from you that every tech bro wants that. When regime changes, the first thing that always changes is land distribution because money doesn't really exist. It's just little digits on your computer, but land really exists. And so,
well, I mean, like this, my fear
yeah,
with like a lot of land is the same with like mortgages at the moment. Like you could say like the bank doesn't own my house, like I own a house, but like the bank actually owns it because like I have a mortgage. So like, and they sort of own like rich people own housing, not big like like BlackRock put out a report a few years ago, like they were looking, can they buy houses and rent them out? And they realized like, no, like we don't make any money off this because it's too much work to maintain a house. So they just own it through your mortgage. Um, they have the capital. Like I would, how do we make sure that we don't end up in some financialized situation where like, we okay, so we overthrow Bill Gates and we take back all the land, and they're like, all right, well, how are we going to distribute this? And they're like, let's all just take out mortgages and see who's willing to pay for it, and it's like, well,
right. First of all, I don't know the answer, right?
yeah.
These things, again, they fray slowly, right? They fray slowly. Like this thing is fraying at the edges, and who knows how it's going to happen. If you're lucky, it happens nicely, right? If you're Vermont, which has a law that every 100 years they can vote to secede from the nation, that's
Do they
happening
really?
in, yes, that's happening in 2090, so it's a bit far off. But imagine that their legislature said, you know what, we needed to change to every 50 years, and they voted on that and they seceded. That's a land with a lot, a fairly close-knit population who know each other, who, if somebody stopped by the side of the road, you pull over and you take care of them. That society might go through a very smooth transition because they're
Sure.
still right. They're not highly urbanized, but a highly urbanized area in California, which is dependent on Colorado for its water, that might be a very unpleasant and is very urbanized. Like that might be a very unpleasant transition. I'm just giving US states, but in Europe, you'll
Right.
have the same thing, right? You'll have highly urbanized places and highly populated places like Germany be more problematic. I don't know, right? What is going to happen? But I think that some places will have smoother transitions and some places will have less smooth transitions. And trust is at the bottom of it, really. Trust is at the bottom of it. Do I trust these people? Because I'm hearing this all over the place. I don't see it, but I'm hearing all over the place that they're older farmers and landowners who'd like to hand off their land to young people, but there isn't that intergenerational trust to say this group of young people has worked here for 10 years and I'm just going to leave it to them in my will because my children don't want it, or maybe I don't have children. Like there are small patches of where that can happen, but it's all based on relationships and we've eroded them. But I do want to say one thing about the debt and the way that the system works in terms of debt. We are at the beginning of a major transition in how our economic systems work. Because since the 1970s, we've been in this situation where there's a huge reserve currency called the dollar, and people all over the world, countries were willing to accept dollars instead of goods in exchange for goods. they'd actually give you, gold and mercury and titanium and all kinds of cool stuff in return for dollars. That's not a normal historic situation. Now we're talking about 50 years, so all of us think that this is the norm, but actually it's a very strange anomaly in the world that you just write on a piece of paper, right? Or like, I'll just mark down on this computer that you owe me, and then I can move the stuff around. It has not ever been the case in the world that you could trade something for nothing. And that system is under threat because it was never sustainable. And Trump's policies are making it really obvious that it's going to end really soon.
Sure.
Right. And so what's going to follow it? Probably a lot less debt. Because what are you going to have debt in? Like, debt is the trust that you're going to pay me back. And the numbers do not indicate, right? If you look at credit card debt is going up and up and up, what's going to happen? People will default.
Well, I mean, you could say it's, like you could say that that's not going to work, and like whether the US dollar succeeds or not, but like bringing it kind of back to crypto here, like we do make up value out of thin air, right?
I
Like,
love it. It's the
yes,
best thing about this industry. It's like, oh, we just invented it out and there's no debt.
but like, couldn't you say that that's a form of, like whether the US, because like the US could very easily structure its dollar not as a debt-based currency, but as, something that you just mint out of thin air. What,
Right.
yeah. So I mean, like,
But what I'm saying is that the size of debt that countries and individuals and companies will allow one another is going to shrink back to a normal level.
sure.
The level at which we're willing to accept fake something is going to go down.
Kind of like the trust levels amongst nations will go down in some ways.
The non-trust levels, like we're in trustless systems, the trustless levels will go down.
Okay.
Money is a trust replacing system. That's why we call it trustless. So money replaces trust. I can stay at your place if I put down this credit card because if I trash the room, you can charge me. So it's a trust replacing system. So again, I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow, right? But over the next 20 years, we're going to see trust has to come back. Because if I don't trust you, you can't stay at my place because there aren't credit cards anymore, right? And again, that started in the 1970s. You're going to have to look pretty decent to stay at my place. And by the way, people of certain races have had that problem. Like I was dating a guy once who couldn't, like I would have to go in and get the hotel room because his physical appearance didn't look good to the receptionist.
Right.
So there's some people who already experience that. And that might be the default. You've got to look decent because, we're not going to,
Pros and cons.
Yeah. But trust is going to have to increase. How will that look? Well, I'm building some of that stuff. If you look at my GitHub, I'm building something called Verifiable Community, which is really about scalable trust.
So on that, like what should we be building? What do you wish people were building more of, or some technologies that might?
So in the technology area, so I won't talk about like the emotional area, resilience, right? And some skills on how to do some physical things. Like I started taking plumbing courses and repair courses. I'm not that interested in gardening. I'm a geek. It's just how it is. So learn at least some physical skills because it's fun also. Like it's kind of nice. And,
Plumber
plumbing courses. Well, it'll save you some money in the long run anyway, right?
Sure.
So learn some skills, but I think we need to build trust, and we need to build trust based on communities of belonging. That's really where I'm focused. And so what does that look like? So we talk about manifestos and conflict resolution, but you have to agree to a manifesto. And so what I'm imagining is there's a couple of things. One is these trust-based systems that are based on a system of belonging. So if I belong to an eco-village is obvious. If I belong to a network state or an eco-village that can issue me a citizenship for my network state, they can also hold me to account for certain things. So my network state or pop-up village or eco-village, whatever you want to call it, will say like this person is a citizen. And if we send them to your organization, right? So we could have a bilateral agreement, just like a passport. We are vouching as an organization that if they don't misbehave, we'll make up for it, right? So if they leave any damage, we as an organization are vouching for this individual. And that could be at any level. It could be at a level of, this person behaves decently at parties. I think in Web3, there's actually a list that goes around among the party organizers of men who don't get invited to parties, even though they might be very wealthy investors. I don't know where that is, but just as a challenge for a hacker, you might want to find that list. I know it exists. I'm looking for the person.
Go ask some people.
Right. If instead of that, you had to show a certificate a verifiable credential or an Ethereum, they have Ethereum credentialing. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but there's if you had to provide a credential that says this group vouches for you, you'd have to hold some. And you could belong to multiple groups and they would mean different things. And, this one means that you're a good guest and this group says for you, this means you don't rug and that group is staking for you or whatever it is. And people without credentials would be very suspect. Like, don't you have any friends? Right. So that's one thing. And then a group could adhere to a code of conduct, you could say. My group belongs to what I'm calling an Ostrom 5. This is the code of conduct my group has. And now my group holds a certificate, a badge, a verifiable credential that says this group adheres to that conflict resolution organization. And then you could have 5 or 10 or 20 organizations belonging to what's basically replacing a judiciary. And then you could trust any of the 10 organizations in that group to know, because if they do something, I know where to go for mediation. And that's the same as saying it's like writing a contract and saying we're going to resolve this in our jurisdiction. We could have different types of conflict resolution organizations that we could go to before we end up in court. And quite, notoriously in our industry, right? Aragon has found itself in court. And it's like, oh, that's really sad. You're a DAO and you ended up in court because we don't have that agreed upon mediation facility. And we resolve some of our stuff on Twitter. It's like Twitter wars are about, we don't have anything better than our court system, which doesn't help us because we're international. And so we need to start forming these trust-based systems based on groups that agree to something, including agreeing to a remediation authority. And so I think those are really interesting things, is how do we build trust? And how do we build digital certificates that help us enforce trust? And I'm a little bit different from a lot of these other organizations. Think you build it by one-on-one individual vouchers, but I think you have to have groups that hold you to account. Because it's really good for me to say that you're awesome. Yeah, I had a call with him. He's great. And it's really expensive for me to say, I don't have anything bad to say about you yet, but if I did, like, even he showed up late, you didn't. But it's very costly for me to say something negative about somebody else.
Right.
And so reputation has to be held by a trust group, because individual to individual vouches are it's just really better. I'm just going to say something nice, even about that person who screwed me, because so reputation really has to be held by a body that's accountable. So I think that creating these communities where we actually know who a member is and who a member isn't, and we can revoke membership for bad actors. Technologically, there's a whole bunch of ways of doing that. Like I mentioned, verifiable credentials, and there's some really interesting self-sovereign identity stuff going on. I think that's really important. Trust and trust vouchers, like I said, being able to hold a badge that says this organization can be trusted. And that's normal, right? We have things like, if there's an organic seal on your eggs or whatever. We need to start doing that within the crypto organizations and the Web3 organizations and these network states. So, because trust is going to be the new currency, I think.
Well, I found it interesting. I know one of the quotes I also had from you was that you said anonymity and distributed governance are a bad idea. And this, it kind of goes against where a lot of DAOs are trying to go, especially more of some of these privacy-focused institutions. I don't know if you'd want to touch any on that.
Yeah. So anonymity, my legal name is not Grace, and that doesn't matter. Right. So knowing somebody's actual name and their actual biometrics is the least interesting thing about them. It's really, can they be trusted in this context? And do they have authority in this context? Right. I might have an opinion about Ukraine, but I'm not Ukrainian and I'm not Russian. And so my opinion about what should be done there might not be so relevant. And so complete anonymity isn't a great idea, and not having consequences. And so, and then the other thing is, so I'm going to separate this from voting, because let's say a decision making process has to happen. One of the ways that we should be, the other thing we should be doing technologically is looking at large language models. And again, Audrey Tang is also very famous for that, is the polis stuff. And we could go a lot further. We could have chat systems which could have summaries of what people are saying just in free form. So we're having a discussion on our Discord channel or our Slack channel or our whatever it is. And then an LLM could come in and say, here are the clouds of different opinions on this particular thing.
Mm-hmm.
And here are the people who are getting the most likes. So these are some of the favorable ideas, or the people who are most popular. Or here are some of the ideas not even associated with people, which are most popular. Or here are the people who are considered the experts, because based on, it could be rather than like something like Slashdot used to have this. Slashdot had, you could write insightful, controversial, funny. So you could actually know who the experts are by running an LLM over discussion on any topic you want. And then you could say, okay, these are the top experts. Let's randomly select out of the 100 experts, let's randomly select 12 of them, put them on a council and have them solve the problem. And forget about voting, because we already know who those 12 experts are. They've been voted for based on their day-to-day speech, not based on their political campaign or advertising campaign, but based on what they said over the last 3 years on this topic. We know these are the people. And so you could actually eliminate voting with today's AI, both on the voting for leaders and voting for solutions, because you can identify the people who are the experts and the opinions that are the most, these are sort of the most agreeable positions. These, we're going to have, of that 12 people, we're going to have 3 controversial people because we need a devil's advocate. We're not going to, and you could create really, really good governance in an automated way instead of voting. And you wouldn't have voter fatigue that way either. So there's a lot of really interesting automated models for governance that we're not building because, I don't know, we got stuck on voting, and voting is really a bad way of deciding things.
It seems fair though. I would say,
doesn't it? It seems fair.
Well, because that's usually the issue that, the problem with a lot, I would say the goal of a lot of governance systems isn't necessarily coming to the best solution. It's getting everybody to agree to the solution.
Yes.
Which
And
is harder.
It seems fair, but it isn't fair.
Right.
I mean, look at who your head of state is everywhere in the world, and look who they were running against. Clearly not the best possible choices. And I've never gone to the ballot and said, wow, these 2 people are so great. I don't know which one to choose.
Yeah,
it only seems fair. It isn't fair.
Yeah. The fear I always have with, Polis seems pretty good so far. I haven't used it too much, but at the same time, so for those watching, Polis is if you have they have issues, and then people basically vote on what they feel, and then you can see where people agree and disagree. It helps sort of find areas of commonality, which is cool.
Yeah, it's a lowest common denominator solution in some ways. Something highly controversial, you need something like a citizens' assembly.
Yeah. Yeah, because it was usually I remember the fact checkers from 5 years ago, they were famous for, especially COVID would come out, and they would say something, and basically half of the people felt as soon as they saw a fact check well, this thing's rigged, and then they would just completely tune out.
Yeah.
So Polis, I feel could fall into that category if you have certain aspects where listen, these 4 experts agree, and then it comes in your face as well, you're wrong on it. How do you use it almost to educate more? How do we design these systems to be more educational and teach people to find the common ground, or where it might be wrong?
Yeah, that's another area where we can really, and again, it is about finding common ground, and citizens assemblies are famous for that. I mean, again, it's building trust, right? So creating citizens assembly like things, or like I said, councils of experts can be done through all kinds of digital means. But the other thing you're pointing at is like truthiness, right? And we've got things like the public comments that are being used on Twitter, which is like, do people think that this is factual? Now, that's really useful in some ways, but problematic in other ways, because people's opinions doesn't determine the truth, right? Like something could be true and everybody could believe it to be false and it would still be true, right? There's gravity. You know, you can believe in gravity or not believe in gravity. It doesn't change how gravity works at all. So, um, there's expertise. And then there's also, so when we think about a media environment, and again, this is a great area that we can improve democracy by improving our media environment. And so these community notes are one way of doing that, of sort of getting to what the community believes. But sensors are another way. If you could imagine that we actually know, right? We have oracles in the crypto world that say, yeah, it actually is this price, but you could also say it actually is this temperature, or it actually is this nitrogen content, it is this polluted, it is. And so if you think about making ecological decisions, or the way that I make decisions or my body makes decisions, it's like I ate that and I felt bad, or we tried this thing to clean up the water and the water got cleaner over 3 months. And so you can actually create AI models and LLMs that will give feedback loops to people who are making decisions. So it's really interesting technology that's being done called 4B.io. And the idea is that you would have voting on different things, like we should clean up the water, or we should, have less fishing. But they didn't stop the voting after it happens. So people could change their mind. So you would make a
Okay.
decision, you'd start executing, but if people start changing their mind and flipping back, you'd be like, oh, the fish aren't getting restored. More and more people think this intervention was wrong. So it's really interesting how you could combine factual information like the size of the fish, or the numbers of the fish, or the quality of the water, along with people's opinions of it. You could create very, very sophisticated computer models for decision making, or interventions, or feedback loops is a better way of thinking of that, because our decisions aren't singular. Our decisions are inside of a feedback loop.
Yep.
And I think that's the other problem with voting, is it has this like singular moment. And again, with Aragon, there was a moment where I can't remember what it was. It had to do with Polkadot, I think, where they had two proposals on the table. One was to support it, and the other one was to not support it. I think one of it was to buy some dots, and the other one was to, break off a ties with them. And both of the proposals passed. Right. And then the next proposal period is 6 months from now. The idea that voting is really difficult to do as a feedback loop. It's not a good feedback loop
It's a very,
system.
very slow feedback loop, you
And
could
it's not
say.
appropriate, right? It's only
Right.
appropriate for certain, like passing the annual budget. And you could also think about voting in terms of fairness, right? There's a difference between fairness and making a good decision. What if every vote had to pass by 80%? We would have much better candidates for president, because only somebody who really could figure out what people really want and honestly agree as human beings on 80% of the stuff. We want better education systems. We want more, we wouldn't be talking about the divisive issues. We'd be talking about what's important to us. We want better,
Sure.
better education, less poverty in our countries. We want clean air, clean water. You'd have to get candidates who could, and policies that would pass. And again, in DAOs, if you had to have policies that got 80%, you'd have to spend a lot more time in the process of writing that proposal, because it would be ratified. Because it's not about voting on a 50% majority or 60% majority is coercive to the people who didn't get what they want.
But you could also say that, like if you require 80% to pass, then you have the downside of the people who like not doing anything are winning most of the time, right? Like so like in a case of like you could imagine like people who want no government would blow up the government and say everything the government does needs 99% things to pass, and then it's like just free market for everything, right? And that's clearly not
Not what we want,
right,
right?
not necessarily, probably not ideal. Um,
Yeah. I mean, these are a number of different ways. And what you're
Yeah.
pointing out is really important, which is we have a lot of different types of decisions.
Yes.
In an emergency situation, you don't want to vote. Like, we want the experts, we have firemen, the firemen will come, the firemen will decide what to do. And they have a very hierarchical, like very hierarchical, based on your physical brawn system. And we don't want to change that,
Right.
right? Like we don't want a democracy around our fire departments.
But then you have issues of who gets to declare when an emergency is taking place, as we
Well,
currently.
yeah. But what I'm
Right.
pointing at is that there's many decisions we make in our lives. There's many decisions that have groups involved in them, and there are different decision-making methodologies appropriate for different types of decisions. And I think the big problem with DAOs, which is obvious, is that people don't vote.
Yeah.
If you can get 10% of the people in your DAO to vote, you're way above average. And so it only seems fair. But actually, what's happening, and this is the big problem with the Gitcoin rounds, right? Which maybe this is a good place to kind of really give an example of how it works. So I finally got around to putting something into a Gitcoin round because
Okay.
guess what? I'm not popular, right? I'm
We're
controversial.
going to work to change this.
I'm controversial, right? And that's okay. Like, I'm not one of those personalities that's always saying nice things about people and whatever. They're very smart people who are very good at getting along with people. And I'm just going to say the truth. And people are like, what? Right. So anyway, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just, I'm not going to win a popularity contest. And voting is a popularity contest.
Yes.
And also my thinking about, like, for example, this verifiable community was what I put into the Gitcoin round. And it's a little bit far out there. It's a little bit revolutionary. It's a little bit like, oh, that might work in 10 years. So we don't want to fund it now. And so now you're in a popularity contest for something that's with a person who's a little bit controversial. And the votes are also transparent. So people know who voted for me. And it's like, some people don't like me and some people do like me. It's like, are we going to vote for Grace? People will know, they'll be able to see our vote for that. And then it's also within Gitcoin, you have to put in $1 and then you've got to bridge to the right network and whatever. But even if it was easy, basically the way that those votes work with quadratic funding is if you bring in $1, right, you get more, there's matching funding, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now it really becomes a popularity contest. And most people don't have to do anything, right? People don't have to vote in that round. So who are you going to vote for? Like, some people join Gitcoin rounds because it's fun. I happen to be one of them. I've done a lot of Gitcoin rounds and a lot of Giveth rounds, and the Giveth interface is a lot easier. But why am I, like, and again, I'm not saying anything you couldn't look at my MetaMask to find out, right? How many Give tokens do I have and blah, 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 right? It's fun to vote for my friends when they're trying to raise money. Like, it's fun.
Yeah.
And that's why I do it. I don't do it because that's the best project on Giveth or on Gitcoin. I do it because it's my friends.
Because your
Or
friends ping you and they're like, can you go vote
they're
for
like,
me
can you
on
do this?
Bitcoin?
And
Yeah.
like, right. And now we're at round 24 on Gitcoin, and whatever it is, round 20 on Giveth. And I'm like, oh my God, my friends pinged me again. Right.
Yes. Like
And then
give
right?
them $5 and call it a day. And
Right. And it's not a democracy anymore. It's a popularity contest. And in the particular round that I was, the person who got the most got 50 votes. Is that democracy? Does that mean anything? It just means that, and that person is a very deserving person. It was Stephen Reed. He does really great work. He has a great emailing list. And that's why he won, because he could get 50 people to put in money on his project. And is that democracy? I don't think it is. I think it's, and also, just so you know, there's sort of back channels, and it's like, I'll put it all on your project, you put it all on my project, because there's matching funding, so it's worth it for me to do that.
right.
And everybody's doing that. And now it's really, really not democracy. I could tell another story about the Singularity Net, which they recently, in one of the rounds I was in, they got expert opinions. And so they were paying experts to rate these different things. And I was one of the experts, and we were rating one of the categories. And there was, I think, a 40% correlation between what the experts thought and how the voting went in the end.
Okay.
Right. So these voting systems are not really doing a good job for making good decisions.
Right. Well, I mean, some people would say, yeah. So I guess like we like more educational things like Polis or community nodes, trying to sort of broaden, almost like on the education piece. But then when it comes to actually making the decisions, it almost just it comes down to having a community that's focused on a single goal, or actually like, yeah, you have something, and maybe it's better to codify that, like you use AI to pick it, or something that's less corruptible, I
I
guess you could
think
say.
part of the, I mean, it really depends. I mean, there's a question about, is there a better decision? And
Yeah,
does it matter if it's a better decision or an effective decision, or does it matter that we all feel good about it? I had a guy who got to me with this. He wanted to do a DAO and he was working on some island, and every 6 months the EU was giving him $10,000. And it turned out that what people really wanted to do was kind of take the $10,000 and split it into 1,000 tranches and kind of give all of the community projects 1,000, because they didn't care about having the best decision. They cared about distributing it evenly among the people who were working in the arts. They didn't care about the most beautiful artwork. They were just like, we want all of our artists to have a little something.
that's a great way to think about it.
Right. And so maybe efficiency isn't what we're going for.
It seems like that's antithetical to crypto at the moment. Um, it's
Yeah.
yeah,
But I'm just saying every decision is different. So the decision making methodology, there is no one methodology that is the right decision making methodology for every decision.
yeah. Well, I would say
And
a lot of
yeah,
it is too, we would kind of go back to the beginning with the discussion on financialization. It's, you know, are these DAOs compatible with hyper financialized crypto tokens? And do they make sense there? Like what parts, how can we sort of build our crypto tokens differently to make it, we all have this goal of we want to create this democracy, this system that we can all live in and thrive in and use. So say we want to make a currency. What's a good model for it?
I personally think that monetary currencies are just too limited as the circulatory system for society. And I think that markets are not a good way to make equitable, like, I don't like equity necessarily, but not a good way to make decisions about our natural environment, like the globe that we live on. And I think that the crypto systems and the monetary systems that we're doing right now are going to be kind of life rafts as our existing monetary system breaks down. They're hopefully going to get us to this other side where we can have some of the systems I talked about, like resource-based allocation, trust that's built within groups and communities. That's going to take us 100 years at least
Sure.
to build new governance systems that are culturally, and again, the network states everybody's going to want a different culture. That's good. That's fine. We have different religions, different cultures. We want German cars and French food. I mean, that's what we want, right? Like we want different cultures. And so
Right.
there's no rule for everybody. And I think crypto is going to help us, as our current system is collapsing, organize ourselves into other systems. But I think it's just a bridge. I don't think that monetary systems represent the best of what we can do with our existing technology.
Yeah. No, I think this is a great place to kind of, yeah, start wrapping it up.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you're working on that you would kind of want to discuss along these lines, or
I mean, I'm super excited about the identity stuff. I think and I'm working, I think the thing that also say is I'm working with the bioregional movement, the Design School for Regenerating the Earth. And right now I'm in Cascadia. I was at the Cascadia BioFi conference. I think that there's a really important bridge for crypto um, to these communities that are also trying to create a new type of society. And I think the marriage of these ecological movements with the technology that Web3 is bringing has a tremendous hope for our future. And so I would encourage people to bridge the gap, go to some of these community meetings, see how you can use crypto in the real world.
are there any?
Yeah.
Do you see? Like I recently I went to a conference at Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
and talking to a lot of the young the college students, that they seem to have a big distaste in their mouth for anything crypto term.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, how do we sort of, do we rebrand? Is there some way to, you know come into this in a more positive light to bring people in, because kind of like you said, like I too see that there's a lot of hope in some of this technology that we're building, and it is super cool experiments. But like, how do we get past what we've done?
People don't need to know what database they're using.
Sure.
Right. Blockchain is just I don't know whether I'm using a relational database or whatever, right? And so people don't need to know they're using it. I think crypto has been trying to make itself a thing in a way that no other type of database has tried to do. And so it's not about crypto. It's about, do I have an application that you can use, and how does it look, and how easy it is, and whether my verifiable credential is an NFT, which I don't recommend, or some other kind of cryptographic proof, shouldn't matter to the end user.
Right. Okay. I really like that. So anyway, where can people find out more? Where can people go to get
So they can either go to gracerachmany.com, which has all of my stuff, or DAO Leadership. And people who want to read the book, so you've got a DAO, which the subtitle is The Great DAO Fail Expose. And it has a lot of ideas about how to change that, as well as references to other organizations that do decentralized governance. So DAOleadership.com is a great place to go for some ideas of, what could I do if I weren't doing voting?
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was a blast.
It was great. Thank you so much.